What's going on, everybody? Noah from Stage 3 Motorsports here, and today I'm going to show you how to install some Fox 2.0 coilovers and rear shocks on your F-150. Before we get started, I wanted to point out that the truck we're working on is a 2021 F-150 STX, and it's a four-wheel drive model. So the steps to install the Fox suspension here should be pretty much the same for any other model of F-150, but you will want to confirm with Fox that the kit's going to fit if you have something a little more unique. Now, with that being said, the other thing I wanted to point out is that this truck already had a 2.5-inch leveling spacer on there that we installed previously. So I am taking that out with the stock coil when we do this install, but it shouldn't really change the steps as far as what you're following along with, and I'll make notes for anything that is slightly different. So with all of that out of the way, let's get into the install and we'll show you how to get it done. First thing we need to do is grab a ratchet with a 10mm socket, and we're gonna back this screw out so we can move the bracket off that holds the ABS and the brake lines. That way there's a little more slack for us. Then we're also gonna take a 21mm socket to remove the nut here for the sway bar end link, and that will help in giving us a little more play. Next, you'll want to grab a pry tool so we can pop these little plastic connectors off here, and that's just going to give us a little more room to get a wrench back here so we can loosen up the upper control arm. To loosen this nut, you're just going to need a 21mm wrench. Same thing on the other side of the upper control arm, and this is just going to take some tension off of those bushings so that way this thing isn't spring-loaded when we separate it. Grab some vice grips or some channel locks, and we're going to pull this little dust cap off so we can get to the axle nut. You're going to need a 13mm deep well socket to remove the axle nut, and what we'll do is back it out to the edge of the threads and leave it on for now, so that way there's a little more play for the axle to move backwards, and then if we need to completely remove it to get a little bit more slack out of it, then we can. But the other thing I want to point out is that for removing this nut and putting it back on, you want to do it by hand with a ratchet. Don't use an impact on this because you'll risk damaging the axle itself, and that'll be a whole nother world of hassle for you. Next, you'll need to use a 21mm deep well socket to back this nut off the tie rod end, so that way we can pop it out of the knuckle. Now we can separate the knuckle from the upper control arm, so we're going to remove the nut here at the bottom with a deep well 18mm socket, and you just want to be careful as you do this. With the upper control arm bushings being loose, there shouldn't be any tension on here, but if you didn't loosen those up, this thing can snap back as soon as it separates, so we just want to gently guide them apart. If you're having trouble getting the nut down because your socket won't fit or it's pushing the ratchet out of the way, then you can also use a wrench to get this free. Move down underneath your lower control arm, and we're going to back off both of these nuts that are holding the lower mount for the strut. So you'll just need an 18mm deep well to get these out. Coming back up to the top of the strut, there's going to be 3 nuts here holding it to the truck. So we'll use an 18mm socket to back these off. So from here, in your guys' situation, you should be able to put a little pressure pushing down on the lower control arm, and you can back that axle nut all the way off if you need, but that'll give you enough room to pull the strut down and out so that way you can remove it from the truck. Now, because we have a spacer on here, like I explained earlier, ours doesn't have quite that amount of room. I'm gonna have to pull it out a little differently, but we'll drop in a clip real quick where you can see how it would normally come apart, so that way you guys kind of have a frame of reference. So we'll jump back in after I get ours free. All right, now that you've got your factory struts out, you should be seeing a very similar view here to what we have on our truck. But before I throw the Fox suspension in, I am going to install these SPC Camber Caster Bolts. And this isn't a requirement, but I do recommend it because it is going to help correct your alignment, especially with a bit of a lift on the truck. And it's worth having if you plan to spend some time in the dirt and run your truck a little harder off-road, because it's going to hold that alignment in better than the factory hardware will. Like I said, not a requirement, but if you are installing these, stay tuned. If not, you can skip ahead and just jump back into the Fox install. The first thing you'll need to do is remove the splash guard that's normally sitting right here. I already pulled ours out because I had to do these camber caster bolts on the opposite side, but once that's free, it only really takes 4 screws to get it out. And then you can come in and we're gonna use a 21mm wrench on the inside for the bolt head. And then on the front here, you'll use a ratchet with a 27mm socket. We can loosen this up, and we're gonna start with just this front mount first. We'll pull that out, and then I'll tape our template in here so we can drill out a hole. That way there's something to hold the plate and we can adjust against it. All right, now that we got the template in and we marked our hole, we punched it, all we need to do is peel this off, and I can use a 5/16 drill bit to bore this hole out. That way that plate has somewhere to mount, and you just wanna make sure that this hole is basically lined up with where the factory hole is on the other side. But the other thing you wanna be sure of is that your lower control arm is shifted over to where you're not just gonna drill straight into it or damage it. It's a little hard to keep it out of the way sometimes, but you can put the factory bolt in from the other side to help hold it forward. That way it isn't getting in the way. And then just be careful as you're drilling so that way you don't ram the drill bit through it. But with that being said, we'll peel this off of here and get that hole punched out. I've got the new camber caster bolt here, and you'll just want to get that oblong washer on there and then the plate. We'll slide this through, and then the other thing to note is that the bolt for the front is actually longer than the bolt for the back, so just make sure you have the right one. For these new bolts, you basically just need a 27mm socket and a 27mm wrench to hold it on both ends. So it's a little different from the factory bolt, but we're gonna snug this one up, and then we can do the exact same steps on the other bushing. All right, so now that we've got the camber caster bolts in, we can grab our new Fox 2.0 coilover. We're gonna slide this up into place. I'll attach some of the top hardware loosely to kind of hold it, and then we can work on getting everything buttoned back up. We've got the top of the coilover hanging on loosely, so now we're gonna take Fox's hardware, which are these new bolts with the little washer on them. We're gonna run those up through the bottom to the bar pin and kind of pull this together. Then we can get these tightened and go back to the top to finish tightening the nuts up there. Next up, we can bring our knuckle back into place, and we'll drop the upper control arm ball joint into it, tighten that up, and then we'll continue piecing things back together from there. With our upper control arm seated in the knuckle and the tie rod seated in as well, now we can tighten up this axle nut. And like I said earlier, just don't use an impact on this. You really only need to hand tighten it with a ratchet. So just be careful or else you're going to cause damage. Moving over to the upper control arm again, we're going to use a 21mm wrench to tighten up that bolt we loosened up before, and then it will kind of spin on the inside as well, so you'll need an 18 to get in there. And you can either snug these up and then wait till the vehicle's weight is down on the ground to then tighten them completely, or you can tighten them now. There's a bunch of different thoughts on what's a better way to do it, but regardless, you just don't want them super loose. Now let's reattach all these little plastic connectors that hold the lines that we pulled out earlier. Last two things we need to button up are going to be the bracket that we pulled off here earlier, and then we'll bring that sway bar end link back up into place. And for the end link, just make sure that if you disconnected it on the opposite side, that you reconnect it on both sides, or else you're going to have some issues with your sway bar. We've got everything put back together, so the one final step to do before moving to the back of the truck is to grab your torque wrench and just tighten up anything that we loosened up along the way. Now, any of the factory nuts and bolts that we pulled are going to just go back to factory spec, but for the Fox coilover, these top nuts are going to go to 24 foot-pounds, and then the bottom bolts that go into that bar mount are going to be 50 foot-pounds. So you can find some of this info in your manual when you install it, but just mentioning it now. Moving back to the rear shocks, these are thankfully a lot more simple than the fronts. So starting at the bottom mount here, you're going to want to use a 15mm socket on one end and an 18 on the nut for the other end. And we're just going to break this loose, and then we can back the nut off all the way. For the top mount, we just need a 15mm socket for this side, and then there's actually a wing on this nut that keeps it from spinning all the way around, but if you want, you could put a wrench on the back side too to hold it. Now we're going to take our new Fox 2.0 rear shock, and you want to position it with the body towards the top and the shaft pointed downward, and then we're just going to reuse the factory hardware for both the top and bottom mounts. All right, folks, that's going to be a wrap on this install for the Fox 2.0s, but one important note, you do want to make sure you get your truck professionally aligned before you go put some miles on this thing, and it is safe to drive it to the alignment shop. You just don't want to run a lot of highway miles on here because we've altered the geometry quite a bit, and it's going to wear your tires weird and possibly steer and veer around kind of funny on the road if you don't have it locked in. So make sure you get a professional alignment done. But with that being said, after you have that locked in, you should be good to go. And if you guys are interested in picking up a set of Fox suspension for your F-150, we'll have some links down in the description. Those are going to shoot you over to our website. So as always, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.